Imagine yourself under a starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights. Creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands. Here are your hosts,
Sarenth Odinson, Snow, Cabra, and Emily Streaking Fate.
Discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
Hail to the gods of the skies, the gods whose names are in our planets, the holy ones that hover overhead, that show us who we have been, who we are, and where we are going. Hail to the ancestors who are astrologers, astronomers, seers, and mystics, who looked from this world to other worlds, from this blue dot in the vastness of space outward to ask the needed questions. When to plant, what is going to happen, and how. Hail to the spirits of those planets, the Olympic planetary spirits, the holy ones that reside atop, betwixt, between. The Pleiades, the Big Dipper, and all the astrological events we look up to. The North Star that guides our way, the pole star that shows us true. All those blessed burning lights that give us guidance, that tell us truths, even those we don't want to hear, that show us our potential and shower us with their understanding. Thank you for your guidance, thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for showing us your ways. Wow. Welcome to another episode of Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 142 with my good friends and co-host, Snow. How are you doing tonight?
I am all right. I have been doing lots of life admin things, and life sure is adminning lately. And the holiday season is upcoming, and that is always expensive and stressful and involves lots of life and lots of admin. How are you?
I am doing well. Also, not looking forward to the coming holiday hell that is our yearly celebration of the solstice here in the States, because we have just this really weird relationship with the holidays, and I'm very happy that our section of the family is resistant to that. Actually, it's funny, like around the dinner table tonight, as we were shoving food in our face before the broadcast, we were having a talk about the upcoming Titanic shifts and what is probably going to be our finances because of the tariffs and all the other crap that's coming down the pike. So what's this next year going to look like for us? And how we're going to batten down the hatches and prepare for anywhere from 20 to 60% increase on everything. So a lot of our minds are bent towards that right now because, well, we just had an election and now we're going to have to deal with the fallout.
Did you have an election? No one had said. Did the US have an election? You guys should talk about that more.
Totally.
Outside the US, we never hear about these things.
Oh, God. So that's what's been on my mind lately. And so one of the things that the local community has asked me to do is to put together a workshop on spiritual preparedness for trying times. So that'll be fun. It's about 4,000 words long at present, and My hope is that it won't take as long as it took to write it up to get people's heads around what spiritual preparation looks like in crisis, in emergency, disaster, and catastrophe. Because a lot of my experience with that has been working for the state, and so I'm kind of bringing that information to bear because a lot of that stuff is really relevant for the times we're in. With the first aid training, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say spiritual preparedness for trying times. You've got about 4 years worth of trying times, right?
Yeah, about that, depending on how this goes.
I mean, the election run up takes what feels like 4 years. So
that's because we started 2 years previous, so this will be fun.
I mean, I feel like every day up to the US election feels like 2 years. But
I'm so sick of fucking ads. I'm so like, if nothing else, I'm happy the election's over because the ads have gone from electioneering and all that crap to the most recent boxing match, which took everybody to disappointment land. So
I didn't even bother watching it. I was like, this isn't going to be satisfying whichever way it goes, because a once very successful athlete is now going to get beaten up by a YouTuber. I don't need to see this. And that's what happened.
Pretty much.
And there were rumors it was rigged from the start, so
yeah. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. I'm a lot of what I'm doing right now, besides that, is I'm finishing up my poetry work with the runes. I think I've got 3 left, and those are going to be posting in the next few days. And so that's been really fun.
How far around your arm are you?
Almost to the end. Almost to the end. I'm almost here. I'm almost here at the last 3.
Okay. Yeah.
So, my handy dandy.
It's the real reason he got the runes tattooed around his forearms.
I'm never going to forget where they are.
He makes out that it was some kind of spiritual oath and commitment to his relationship with them. Really, it's just to help him remember them. He got fed up of the pen washing off his palms, so he just got them tattooed around his forearms.
It fucking works. So, without too much further ado, would you like to introduce our wonderful guest?
I would love to introduce our wonderful guest. So we are joined tonight by Andrew B. Watt. Andrew is an astrologer, artist, magician, and writer based in Massachusetts in the US. At Wanderings in the Labyrinth, he is known for his writings around the astrological decans, his regular horoscopes, and his poetry. So Andrew, welcome to Around Grandfather Fire.
Delighted to be here.
Delighted to have you. So, you want to jump right on into it? Like, how did you first come to astrology?
So I think a lot of astrologers come to astrology first and foremost through astrology. They read a sun sign column in the newspaper, they get excited about it. And I don't know that this is true of a lot of professional astrologers, but a lot of the professional astrologers that I know personally are very real, very down-to-earth people, and they are not, by and large, magical people. Like, they're doing magic, or at least they're doing divination, or they're providing counseling services, but they're very much not approaching it from the perspective of being occultists or being magicians. I came to it through magic. I came to it first and foremost through trying to understand how astrology fits in with magic, and sort of kept going deeper and deeper and deeper down that particular rabbit hole, and eventually wound up in a position where I faced a bit of a career choice point, I guess is a good way of saying it, a place where I had a fork in Destiny's garden, and I looked at my options, and I went down the road of astrology, and when I looked back, there was only one path behind me.
I have to ask, because astrology is an intimidating field to me. What is it when you come to astrology, what is it that really inspires you to dig into it? Like, what is it? Because like I can understand like when it comes to the runes, oh, there's all this lore and there's all these things to learn. What is it about astrology that really fires you up?
Let me respond with a counter question, which is, do you feel like you got interested in the runes because the runes are cool, or do you feel like the runes called out to you and said, you are ours?
That.
Yeah. So I think it's very much the same thing with astrology for a lot of people. I can't speak for everyone, but I do feel that astrologers are called to the field uh, rather than just go, oh, this is neat. I have a story about this actually. I've sort of been reluctant to tell this story. I can't remember whether I told it on a podcast or not. But my uncle worked for a newspaper out in California for a while. This is in the early 1960s, I think. He was just out of college, and the newspaper editor-in-chief said, "Hey, would you be willing to write a sun sign column?" And my uncle apparently said something to the effect of, "I don't know anything about astrology. Why would I do this?" And the editor-in-chief said, no, you write 6 and Joe over on the sports desk will write 6 and you will, you'll split the fee and we won't pay an astrologer. We'll just write this stuff in-house. It's just 3 or 4 sentences for each of the signs. And we'll publish whatever you write, whether it's right or not, it doesn't matter to us. So they did this for several months. And they discovered that one of their colleagues, a young woman, was deeply invested in their astrology column and wanted to know how they came up with the column and was deeply concerned with how they came up with this. And they said, oh, well, we consult a lot of star charts and we actually have to go to a great deal of trouble. And they didn't. They, just sort of made shit up every single day and tried to make sure that they didn't say the same thing too often in a row. But they were making it up completely. But they realized that their colleague was deeply invested in it. So one day they conspired with one another and they said, we know that she reads, I don't know, the Sagittarius one fairly frequently and she pays a lot of attention to that. So let's put in today, some friends of yours will each ask you for what feels like quite a lot of money, but you should loan it to them anyway. And you will get the money back. So they put this in the column. It came out in the newspaper the next day. And the following day, each of them independently approached her and said, hey, can I borrow $30? And this is at a time when $30 in the US is sufficient to buy a week's groceries. Like, it's a lot of money. So they had $60 between them, and they took themselves out to the nicest restaurant in San Jose, a steakhouse of some kind, and had a bottle of wine at lunchtime, and they had a great lunch. But at the end of the meal, after they'd polished off a bottle of wine, they sort of went, we really played a really terrible trick on her. We should fess up and we should give her the money back. And feeling very much abashed for this, they went to her and they said, look, we played a trick on you. We put it in the paper yesterday that you were going to get touched for money, and we don't want you to fall for this trick again with the astrology. And here's the money back, and, don't do this again, because this is, we did in fact set this up deliberately in order to deceive you and rob you of your money. And she said, but the horoscope came true. I was invited to loan a lot of money to some friends of mine, and I got it all back anyway. And, so even though they didn't consult any charts at all, somehow the stars conspired to make sure that the horoscope that they delivered was in fact the correct horoscope for this lady for that day. Even though it was intended to deceive and cause harm, it it in fact worked out to the advantage of the horoscope reader rather than to the horoscope writers. Incidentally, there's another part to this story, which is that my uncle and his friend at the desk, shortly thereafter, were asked to pass the column over to someone else. So the act of trying to use it facetiously or falsely in order to gain from it personally resulted in them being asked not to do it anymore. Not directly. It's not like the editor-in-chief found out that this was the case, but the stars certainly were aware of it. And at some level, the stars decided, okay, these people are not adequate listeners to the stars. They don't hear the song of the stars. So we're going to shuffle them out of this responsibility, and we're going to give the responsibility over to someone else. And they lost the weekly income that came from doing this as a bonus responsibility for the paper. So I think that there's, like, at every single level, this is fractal. We're called to the work of being astrologers, just like we're called to be lore masters, or we're called to be priests or sacrificers or magicians or druids or what have you. And if we violate the terms of those responsibilities, the universe finds a way to sort of shuffle us off of those responsibilities. But they do figure out a way to put you to work knowing what you know how to do.
I love this story. I really love it in part because am I being called to worship this god is a question that I see often enough in pagan and occultist circles that some people have just started responding with, you don't have to be called, which is true. You don't.
You don't have to be called.
But that resonance that you're talking about with this story and the calling of the stars to do things correctly, it just, for me, it really clicks. Like, even if you're not being called, you're in a sense being called, brought to, however you wish to phrase it. I find that really kind of comforting, right? Because like you said, if this isn't for you, like, it's gonna get taken away sooner or later if this isn't for you. I don't know. There's a lot of layers to it that I really, really jive with, and I appreciate you sharing that.
It's worth saying, I think I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. So I think I said on Doug Batchelor's show that, how do I put this? That when I first decided to start doing this professionally, I looked at my own chart and I said, okay, based on my own chart, I'm going to get to do this for somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 years. I have something in my natal chart that says that I will be good at this generally, but there also appears to be a window in my life where I will be particularly good at this. I've now been writing a professional astrology column now for 5.5 years, going on 6. So I'm more than halfway through that period, and I don't know exactly how it is that I'm going to end my time as a professional astrologer, but there does seem to be a defined window. And I think that that's another thing to think about when it comes to working with gods. Like, you may be called to work with the god now, but it would be worth setting some parameters. Like, I will work with you for 3 months and we'll see how it goes. I will work with you for a year and we'll see how it goes. I will work with you for a decade or 6 months or, 3 years or 1 lunar cycle. And we'll see if this is a relationship that works to both of our advantages, and we'll go from there.
Because I think even if you sort of take it day by day, you're then just kind of checking in and reviewing each day. And then so every day then becomes an extension rather than the assumption it'll just go on forever.
I can never remember if it's Vladimir Horowitz or there's another pianist and I can't remember his name. But whoever it was, classical musician, says if I don't practice for a day, I notice. If I don't practice for 2 days, the orchestra notices, and if I don't practice for 3 days, the audience notices. And I think that that's true. Like, I finish writing my column, I publish the column, I take a day off, and the next day I open a new WordPress file and I start writing the next column. And it's just sort of this ongoing process of looking 10 days ahead and trying to get a sense of what's happening in the future. And I find that if I don't do that, it's much harder to write the column. The number of clients that I have drops. The sense that I know how to listen to the stars starts to fade away. It's a much more challenging kind of operation. So you really do have to start right away in any 10-day sequence. And I'm sure that people who write daily astrology columns go through a very similar process. If you're not sort of looking at the charts every day, uh, it becomes very difficult after a while. On the other hand, it rewards immediately if you get up in the morning and you call up on your phone your astrology app or whatever, and you look at the chart of the day and you say, what's going to happen to me today? Which is probably the best way to learn any divination system, right? Ask yourself a standard daily question, look at what comes up in the runes or the planets or the geomancy chart and or in the tarot cards, and before you know it, you have a really good sense of what cards mean on a very localized basis for your own life, for your own community, and you will also have enough proof to know whether or not that divination system works accurately for you or not.
I'm curious then, do you feel like you use astrology more for divination or for magic or for kind of the forecast, as it were? Or is it some kind of, or do you view those as kind of blurred?
I used to think of astrology as being its own thing. Like, you do a geomancy reading to sort of get a sense of what your day is like, your own personal day is like, and then, or you draw a tarot card to get a sense of your own personal day. And then you look at the astrology to get a sense of what the space weather is. I think it was Austin Coppock who first called it space weather, and then Gordon White picked up on it, or vice versa. I think it came out of one of their conversations. In any case, I think that that's a really good way of looking at it to begin with. On the other hand, I'm 5 years, 6 years, 8 years into this. 6 years professionally, maybe 8 or 9 in a dedicated way, and like 12 in a sort of casual way. And it it kind of infiltrates everything.
Right.
Like, I know Norse practitioners for whom the Nordic practice has fingers in everything else that they do, right?
Yep.
And I think that there are a great many astrologers who say, okay, here's astrology, and here's what I do for cooking for my family, and here's what I do for social time. And for me, all three of those things have wound up overlapping. It's influenced how I practice religiously. It's influenced how I cook. It has influenced how I do divination, of course, and it has influenced how I do magic. It's not one thing. It's actually, it layers into everything. For a while, I was a school teacher, and I realized, oh, I could do this really cool thing. I have to wear jacket and tie every single day to class. I have to start the day in jacket and tie. I'm just going to wear a tie in the planetary color. And, 25 years on, I can look at photographs of myself and go, I don't know what day that photograph was taken, but I know it was a Tuesday.
Right. Yeah. So if someone sort of was starting out, or had maybe just kind of got the basic sort of 12 signs, 12 houses, maybe 7 planets, kind of a very rudimentary grasp on them, and said, okay, how do I approach a chart for astrological magic? And someone said, how do I approach a chart for astrological divination? Would you give them the same advice?
No,
Or would
I
you tell them to point at different things? Okay.
I would start off by telling both groups, start with planets.
Right.
Right. In the Western world, in the European English speaking world, the Anglophone world, we have 7 planets or 7 days that are named after the 7 planets: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And I would start by paying attention on the day of the planet to what that planet is doing in the chart at the moment that it occurs to you to ask that question. You and I are interviewing at the moment on Saturday night, and at the moment Saturn is in Pisces. I'm trying to call up the chart and the thing is not working. In any case, here it is. It's at Pisces. It's at Pisces 12. Pisces 12 is in the middle decan of Pisces, and the middle decan of Pisces is called the net. And when we were dealing with with Neptune in this position in a few years ago, there was an enormous conversation going on about delusions and illusions and false information and propaganda on the internet and bots. Because Neptune, among other things, is the planet of long-range visions and delusions. It's also the planet of addictions and psychedelics and psychotropics of various kinds. And it was found in 1846. So it was found at a time when human beings were starting to wrestle with the problem that it was now possible to take a photograph. And so you could have a realistic depiction of something. So our whole ideas about what art was and what art was for started to go through a transformation. It was also the beginning of pulp novels, the ability to print cheap paperback books or even cheap hardcovers in large quantities and having mass market media of various sorts. I think it's Robert Forsyth who is it Pillars of the Earth? I think it's in Pillars of the Earth in the 25th anniversary edition says the basic job of a novelist is to write a novel this year, a novel next year, a novel the year after, a novel the year after that, and so on for 25 or more years, writing at least one book a year. And if you build your audience on each book, each of those members of your audience will go back and read everything that you published beforehand. And it means that at the end of your life, you'll have enough of a windfall to retire, maybe, which is kind of a crazy way to live, right? But if we think about that as the kind of model, then it means that Neptunian factors like being an artist or being a novelist or being a filmmaker is to produce 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 of these transformational works over a long period of time, or 25 or 50, and gradually change the way that society sees itself and understands itself because they have understood your vision, or at least they've been transformed by your vision. Victor Hugo, with Hunchback of Notre Dame, managed to convince Parisians that Notre Dame Cathedral was worth saving and that it deserved to be restored. I don't know how long it took him, but it took him longer to write the novel and see to it that it got read by a large enough audience to transform how Parisians thought about the building. And
I want to say 20 years, if memory serves.
And that sounds right. I remember reading an article about it, but I don't remember the details. But 20 years sounds about right. And that's how long it takes Neptune to do things. So Neptune in the part of Pisces that's called the net, and that is an Austin Coppock name from the book 36 faces, but wait for the second edition. If you go out and you look for the first edition, you will pay a fortune for it and it will not be in great condition. And the new version has been expected any day now for about 4 years.
Yeah.
So in any case, I have found that planets in the net usually have something to say about how the internet functions. So we've had Neptune there for a long time over the last few years, and its illusions and delusions on the internet. And now Saturn is there, and we're talking about restricting the internet. We're trying to figure out whether or not AI is actually good for anything at all. And the realistic costs and benefits of the internet are starting to be considered seriously. I mean, it costs the electrical output of a small city, maybe even at this point a large city, to keep the thing running day to day. Is it worth it? Saturn is going to answer that question, and we may not like it.
Hmm.
So yeah,
to answer the previous question, it took him about 3 years to write the actual novel, and probably another, I think from what I was seeing in summaries, it took another 20 years, I think, for the actual impact of the book to be felt sufficiently enough that the cathedral was saved.
that is the time frame at which Neptune does things. And Saturn works considerably faster, at least in part because it says there are real restrictions and limitations on this kind of stuff. Like, you need to get your facts in order, and things are going to go downhill a lot faster than you think they are because facts matter. One of the ways I like to think about Saturn, in fact, is as nature bats last. Everything that Saturn does is about both perfection and decline. Right now, there is a spider crawling around on my desk, and I don't know what the spider is going to find in terms of what he wants to eat, but sooner or later, he's going to get close enough to me, and I'm going to go smack, and he will be, or she will be, food for other creatures and other beasts, or will gradually desiccate and turn into dust on the floor of my little office here. And or, she'll go her own way. She'll find her way somewhere else, and it's very much eat or be eaten. But there's no new material, right? At least on Earth, there's no new material. And Saturn says that everything sooner or later has to be broken down and repurposed. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about individual atoms or single-celled organisms or us or buildings or empires. Everything sooner or later will be crumbled to dust, and it will be reused for whatever comes next. So meditating on what Saturn means on Saturn's day is a great way to begin, because if you have a really clear image of what Saturn is and who Saturn is and how Saturn works and what Saturn's priorities are, it's easy to look at a chart and say, okay, what is Saturn doing here? It's also worth remembering that in the newspapers, you get a sun sign column, and it's telling you what the sun is saying to each of the 12 signs. But it's the sun that's saying it. You are not your sign. The planets are telling you something because you were born with the sun in that particular part of the chart. So if you're going to study astrology, start with planets. Understand what the planets are, because the planets are persons. They are actors. They are agents. They are individuals. They are the ones who are on stage telling the story. And the signs are places. And you can think of them as like theater sets or movie sets. They are locations. And then the houses are the things that they are talking about. And the aspects are who they are on the cell phone with and whether they're arguing or agreeing with one another. So again, I can call up the chart of the moment, or at least I think I can call up the chart of the moment. No, I can't. My computer is saying, no, you can't do that. We're not letting you. Hang on. There it is. So Saturn is currently in conversation with the moon, and they're arguing with one another. And you can think of Saturn as standing in his rubber wellies in the middle of marshland. Maybe he's somewhere in East Anglia. And he's saying there are real limits. And the moon is in Gemini and saying, but we can solve all of this with technology. We can solve all of this with newly imagined tools and imagination. And we can think our way out of this problem. And Saturn is like, no, I'm standing here in the marshland and there should be 435,000 species here, and there are 432,000 species here. Like, this is a done deal. Now, I can't tell you who wins that conversation, right? But that's the nature of the conversation at the moment, is that Venus is saying, I'm sure that the technologists, or not Venus, the moon is saying, I am sure that the technologists will think of something. I am standing right here in a workshop. I am standing right here in a laboratory. I'm standing here in the alchemist's chemistry lab. And I'm sure that all of these very smart people will think of something. And Saturn is in the marsh saying, the tide's coming in. You better think of something fast.
So, as aspirational and in the clouds as the moon is, Saturn's literally on the ground going, it's going to flood. You may want to think about restricting your movements.
Something very much like that. And I try to start with those kinds of things in mind. I try to start with thinking of the metaphor of what is this planet doing in this place and what are they talking about? And I write from that perspective. I don't write that always. I don't say who they are. Although lately I've been trying to do a shorter piece in my column called Planetary Archetypes. One of the recent ones was, think of the chart today as a farmer's market. And here are all of the characters at the farmer's market. Who's making money? Who's losing money?
Mm-hmm.
Who's petting the dog?
And I think it... Oh, sorry, go on.
I think that kind of thing is helpful for helping people reframe it as, think of the planets as people in places talking about specific things. And then the way through astrology tends to become a lot clearer.
I think that's also probably a really good way of kind of breaking it down and making it seem a lot more accessible for people who do look at an astrological chart and see lots of squiggles and numbers and lines and think it all seems very overwhelming and impenetrable.
Yeah, another way of thinking about it is as something like an algebra problem. Remember when we were asked to figure out what X value was and Y value is? Well, every planet has a list of words. So the planet is a variable, and then there's this list of words that says, okay, think about these themes or these kinds of persons for this planet. Okay, the sign is another variable. Here's another list of possible words that could slot into that particular variable. The house is another variable. Here's a completely distinct set of words for that. Aspects are either plus, minus, multiply, divide, exponent, fractionals, those kinds of things. And if you look at it from that kind of perspective, it also becomes a lot easier to interpret.
Yes, thinking about your sort of mentioning archetypes and narratives and things, I think it was from conversations with you and reading your work that I encountered the idea of the lunar mansions as like a caravansary.
Yeah, that was not my initial insight. I read a Twitter thread, and off the top of my head, I can't remember who I should be giving credit to that. Um, if I find it, I'll send it to you for the show notes. But her specific insight was they're not like mansions in suburbia. This is not a gated community. This is the moon traveling on her regular road, her regular circuit, and every day or every night she's stopping at one of these particularly safe places, one of these walled communities on the route. And some of them are good for some things, and some of them are not so good for those things, and others are great for taking medicine or putting on new clothes, and some of them are not so good for those things. My wife noticed that I have this huge stain on my shirt over here today, and she said, "Are you really going to be on camera with that?" And I said, "I'll just be head and shoulders. It won't be visible." And 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 I'm looking at it going, I think this is the actual shirt that I was wearing when I discovered that days that are bad for putting on new clothes are real. Like this is the occasion when I discovered, oh yeah, you really should pay attention to the days that are good for putting on new clothes and days that are good for ratty old clothes.
See, that I find those kinds of things really fascinating as um so one of the things that is kind of in my orbit at the moment is different kinds of astrological reasons for like good days to cut your hair or good days to uh clean this or that. I find this really fascinating, not only from the position of um it's just I just find it interesting, but also days where I go against the grain of whatever the day is about. It's noticeable how much harder it is.
Yes, it is.
So, like one of the things that I follow is Rune Hjarno Rasmussen has this Nordic animism calendar where he's got the runes that follow according to the runic calendars that have been found in different finds. And I find that when I don't pay as close attention to that as I do to my daily rune draws, and I need to find a way to bring them together. But I'll notice that on days where I don't pay attention to whatever the rune is for the day, I have a harder time with it.
And I think that it's worth asking the question, right? I don't know the answer to this question, but I think it is a worthy question to ask. When I buy into astrology, or when you buy into the runes, or when somebody else buys into Greco-Roman alphabet divination, or pulling what the seven sages advice is for the day, any of these different systems, or pulling a tarot card, does your day go better or worse based on the card that you pulled because the card is warning you, or because you believe the symbol that you have drawn? And I don't know the answer to that.
I honestly think sometimes it depends.
It really does. Like it's kind of like what Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Luke Skywalker at the beginning of A New Hope, right? That the Force obeys your commands, but it also guides your actions. It's both.
Mm-hmm.
It does both of these things simultaneously. And when we reach out to astrology or to the runes or to one of these systems, it starts guiding our destiny, but it also it also there's a double influence.
Mm-hmm.
We're influencing how it works, and it's influencing how we work. Along those lines, the obvious thing to do is to say, look at the day rune in the calendar and say, okay, it is this kind of a day. Based on that, how should I modify my actions? Draw this rune oh, this is what I have to do today.
Right.
And like the world is going to project this at me because this is the calendarized symbol for the day.
Right.
My modified action has to be based around the principles that are encompassed or embodied in this particular rune. I go to an event in Western Massachusetts every year called Twilight Covening,
Ooh.
and this year one of the clans set up a gigantic labyrinth on the lawn in front of one of the buildings at this summer camp. And you walk to the center of the labyrinth, and there's a bowl there filled with little ceramic tiles with runes on it, and you can take a rune and take it with you. And I reach into the bowl and I pull out a rune, and for the first time in a long time, I have no idea what I have drawn. Like, I know a lot of different divination systems, and I can find my way around an I Ching hexagram, and I can do geomancy and tarot, and astrology doesn't really puzzle me anymore. And I was like, oh, it's a rune. I don't know runes. Someone needs to explain this to me. And I asked someone, and they went, oh yeah, that's Halagaz. That's the hailstorm. You're screwed. And somebody else leaned over and said, you're not actually screwed. That is the rune that indicates that the storm has arrived, that things will be different now that the storm has come through and destroyed what it's going to destroy. And everything from this point on is changed, but the change has already come and gone. Like, the thing is done. And what nobody at that gathering, well, a lot of people sort of knew because I had not made a secret of it, but what was not common knowledge at the time for a lot of people was that I had just recently come into possession of my parents' condo in Florida, and Hurricane Milton had made landfall about 2 miles north of that, and the place is I won't say ruined, but it's going to be a long time recovering.
Right.
And I don't know what's going to happen with that. In fact, I have a meeting with the condo association this coming Wednesday to find out whether the building as a whole is salvageable. So the storm has already arrived. There's nothing I can do to change it. But it took somebody else explaining the rune to me for me to understand what it is. And that's kind of the day rune, right? You walk the labyrinth, you take the long and winding path only to be told, yeah, stuff is fucked up. Oh, well, at least it's over.
If it helps give you a little bit of peace, one of the other things that I love about the Anglo-Saxon rune poem in particular is that Hagalaz is also referred to as the ice seed. And especially living here in Michigan, if we don't have our snows, our lake levels get negatively affected. So I take hope from Hagalaz that, yeah, it's basically the tower as far as runes go, but it's also got that twinge of hope at the end of it that, yeah, shit's fucked, but you're going to have potable water.
Yeah, and there is always a balance. It's the same thing with Saturn, right? Saturn is the bad old man of astrology, but at the same time, he's like, nature bats last. Nature will do what nature is going to do, and there's not much you can do to slow down what nature is going to do. Nature is already slow. Nature does not do things the way that human beings do. It takes time, but sooner or later, nature is going to do what nature is going to do. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everything that you know and love is going to fade away into the past. And all of us one day, sooner or later, are going to be forgotten unless we become fossilized along with a hard drive explaining who we were.
And I think off of that, though, I think it's good to sort of consider how perspective impacts a lot, and sort of fear mongering around Saturn or around Hagalaz don't necessarily serve or benefit. And there might be sort of a seed of truth in that that's kind of led to people having those very kind of extreme sort of caricature ideas of these things, but there's kind of more there.
Right. I mean, I said this earlier, I think, that astrology is fractal, right?
Right.
You look at Saturn in somebody's natal chart and let's say it's in house 2 in Aries. Your finances are going to be unstable and you are going to be afraid of poverty for your entire life. That sounds like a terrible fortune on a day-to-day basis if that's your overall life destiny. But that's a life destiny, and it says, okay, you're going to have unstable finances for most of your life. What can you do to plan around that? And I have recommended the book by Mike Michalowicz called Profit First to people who are in that kind of situation, specifically because his recommendation is every time that some piece of income comes in, put 2% of it aside for the rainy day fund and only spend out of that fund every once a quarter as a reward to yourself for making it through the past 3 months. As I said to somebody recently, sometimes it means you get to take your wife out for ice cream, and sometimes it means you get to take your wife out for ice cream at Disney World.
I like that. That's really cool. So, like, the caricature that a lot of people think of when they think of Saturn is he's the old bastard with the scythe that tells you no all the fucking time.
And he does.
And he does. I mean, he's got that caricature for a reason, just like Hagalaz has the caricature of the fucking hailstorm that wrecks your shit and leaves you barren at the end. They're there for a reason, but sometimes you need to hear that no, or this is being removed, and you can like it or lump it. It doesn't matter. It's happening.
Right.
I know one thing sort of Chris Brennan's talked about a lot with regards to Saturn is kind of things aren't necessarily going to be easygoing and things could take a very long time. But once you've figured it out, that'll be set, which is kind of very Saturnian.
Right. Saturn is in part about habits and structures because all structures eventually break down, right? All structures, all habits, all patterns, all deliberate systems that you set up break down eventually. But I was a school teacher for 20 years, and one of the things that I loved reminding my students of is if you get a bad grade on a test, what that means is not that you don't know the material. I mean, it does mean that you don't know the material, but what it does mean is that your study habits have broken down and you need to figure out how to redesign your study habits and your study patterns so that you can succeed the next time around. And that hidden curriculum, if you will, in schools is not something that most teachers know how to explain well. Like, yeah, you're there to learn math and science and English and a foreign language and all that sort of stuff. But really what you are there to do is learn how to build systems of self-discipline and self-management so that you can become successful in life. And that is not something that we do a very good job of teaching, at least in American schools. But that's really what it's supposed to be about. And the more that we can explicitly make that the visible curriculum, the better off we're going to be as a society or even as individuals. Systems break down when they no longer serve you well. And that's when we have to figure out how to redesign or replace them or rebuild them and figure out, okay, these 3 things are working. That's the tower, right? The whole tower has come down and I've got only these 4 blocks standing on top of one another. Okay, yes, but those 4 blocks are really sturdy.
Right.
And we know how to build upon them. And now we have room to try a bunch of other things. We can try speed reading. We can try Pomodoro technique. We can try palace of memory techniques. We have a lot more options now that we've understood that just winging it on a day-to-day basis is not working.
So you've kind of set us up nicely there to transition into sort of another big topic that you're kind of known for talking about, which is sort of groups and organizations and the structures of groups and sort of magical groups and occult groups and so on.
Sure.
So I was just kind of, in your experiences then, what kind of things should people be mindful of when starting out in groups and sort of trying to set up structures, and or alternatively, if they're shopping around for sort of magical groups and communities, what kind of structures and what are kind of red flags to look for there?
So let me start off by saying a little bit about my background so that people know that
Right.
I'm not just talking out of my bum. Back in 2013, I was a school teacher, and I had just started at a new school, and I was still finding my way around. And the head of school said, "I need you to run our school debate club." And I didn't really know anything about how to run a debate club, and I certainly didn't know anything about how to run a debate club alone.
Right.
And my friend Holly came to me and she said, "I know this has got to be overwhelming, but why don't you come and join my Toastmasters club?" Now, Toastmasters is an organization worldwide. I think we're in 146 countries at this point, and it is a public speaking and leadership training organization with 300,000 members, something like 16,000 clubs. We used to be a little bit bigger than that. We were hard hit by the pandemic, of course, as all sorts of volunteer organizations were.
Mhm.
But the idea here was you join a club, you give 10 speeches, they give you an award, and uh, it's pass fail. Like, it's not even pass fail, it's pass pass. You give a speech, you get a little bit of critique and feedback from all of the other members of the club. One member of the club gets up and gives a little evaluation of your speech, and you do that 10 times, and you're on your way to being a better public speaker.
Oh, it's
A friend
literally
of
a
mine,
club around oratory.
it is literally a club around oratory.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
Every club in the world is a voting member of Toastmasters International. So the clubs themselves are unincorporated educational associations of, call it 10 to 20-ish members. If anyone is interested in joining a club, it's toastmasters.org. You can find a club near you. You have to be a member of a club in order to be a member of the international organization. So after a few years, I had served in several different club officer roles. There are 7 officers in every club: a public relations VP, a membership VP, an education VP, a president, a secretary, a treasurer, a sergeant at arms, who does not get to carry a sword and sit at the door like you do in Freemasonry.
Shucks.
But somebody asked me to serve as an area director, and an area director serves as an advisor and coach to the officer teams of 3 to 6 clubs. After a year of that, somebody asked me to be a division director. Now I was in charge of 20 clubs. And then I was invited to run for the number 3 post in a district, and a district is usually around 150 clubs. Well, I ran for the number 3 job. I got the number 3 job. I ran for the number 2 job. I got the number 2 job. I ran for the number 1 job, and I got the number 1 job. And as the number 1 of a district, I had a budget of $50,000 to promote leadership activities. I didn't know anything about spending $50,000. I was a school teacher. Like, what person in his right mind would hand $50,000 to a school teacher who's never handled so much as a classroom budget before? The schools where I taught, they said, you tell us what you want to buy and we'll buy it for you, or we'll tell you you don't have money. I never knew how much money I had to spend, so I didn't ask for very much. Crazy, crazy system. So suddenly I have this responsibility. And I'm thinking, whoopee, I have all these ideas about how to spend it. And I didn't. I had to figure out that year how to run the organization online because that was the year that the pandemic set in. So, as a district number one, as a district director, I was responsible for keeping 140 clubs operational and 2,000 people alive, and making sure that Toastmasters didn't become known as the COVID organization in northeastern Connecticut. So it meant communicating with 900 club officers, 2,000 members, and trying to give daily and weekly advice about whether or not it was safe for people to go back to meeting in person. And newsflash, it wasn't. Like, we never got the news that it was okay to go back to regular in-person meetings. At least not during my year. Nowadays they are. So one, I came up with a budget of $50,000 that I never got to spend. Two, my job became very different from what I had originally signed up for. Three, the trip that I was promised as a district director to go to Paris that year never materialized. My wife is still mad at me about that. In any case, I have served as one of 130 or so people at this very, very high level of leadership within a volunteer organization. And I had unusual responsibilities in that role in a year that was an unusual crisis year. So I'm coming to this question about leadership from a place of information within a mundane membership-based organization. But I still think of myself that when I served in that role for a year, I was a bishop of Mercury or a high priest of Mercury. Like, I was in a group that was responsible for teaching public speaking and oratory skills to thousands of people. Kind of cool. So I'm coming to this conversation from that perspective of somebody who is a volunteer, who has never taken money as pay for the volunteer work that I did in Toastmasters. They paid some expenses, but mostly it's meant sitting on my butt in front of my computer answering emails.
Yep, that's definitely a mercurial job.
Yeah. So a typical Toastmasters club has 7 officers and somewhere between 10 and 20 members. You get 20 people in the room all at the same time, and things are going to go wrong. Guests walk in the door who really want to learn how to be better speakers. And sometimes it turns out that they have been sent to Toastmasters because HR knows that they are creepy and is trying to help them develop social skills.
Oh, God.
Sometimes people walk in and what they are there to do is to learn how to develop public speaking skills so that they can become more successful in the political spheres in which they want to operate. And you find their particular ideas about politics to be repugnant. Toastmasters tries to encourage people not to delve too deeply in their experimental speeches and in their practice speeches into difficult topics like politics or religion. But some people don't take the baldly stated hint. So how do you cope with that? A Toastmasters club has a 10 pages of documentation detailing how clubs are supposed to be run. It's called a constitution and bylaws. And there are very specific rules about how the Toastmasters Club itself can alter that document. They can't. The only organization that has the power to alter the typical club constitution and bylaws is Toastmasters International. It takes a majority vote of 16,000 plus clubs in the world to alter that constitution and bylaws. So you're in suburbia, or you're in rural America, or you're in an urban area, and somebody says, "Hey, do you want to join my coven?" We have 12 members and we meet on alternate Saturdays.
Right.
Okay, how does that coven run? Is it the standard high priestess and high priest? Is there a maiden mother crone set up? What is the organizational structure of this? Is it a casual circle of friends, or is there some kind of an admission right? Is there some kind of set of rules or guidelines about how we're going to enter into this spiritual space? And more often than not, there is nothing. There's no written documentation. There's no explanation. I have joined D&D groups that have more rules of order and more sets of guidelines about how we're going to behave in Google Docs, fully searchable, than most spiritual groups that I've encountered. And I think we owe it to ourselves to say, okay, we live, at least in the Anglophone sphere, we live in a world that is governed by the written word. Why wouldn't we want that to be true of our spiritual spaces? Why would we deliberately subject ourselves to the possibility of authoritarian structures in our spirituality when we live in a democracy? Even if you're a conservative, we live in a republic. We are not governed by kings. We are not governed by authoritarians. So I think of Henry M. Roberts' book, Robert's Rules of Order, as being a grimoire of tremendous power. Something like 60% of the volunteer and corporate boards and organizations in the United States, a substantial number of our political arms and bodies run on Robert's Rules of Order, or on modified rule sets based on Robert's Rules of Order, which is itself based on the Manual for the United States Senate, originally written by Thomas Jefferson. So here in the US, at least, we have a spell book of tremendous power that says, have you considered Rule 225 in what you're about to do? Or are you just being unfair because you haven't given it any thought whatsoever? I think that in Britain, there is a similar book that was originally composed by Thomas May, who was the clerk of the House of Commons in Parliament.
That sounds familiar.
So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
If you want a spirituality that is at least as rooted in democracy, or in bottom up, people are connecting with the gods, then at some level your priesthood and your spiritual authority has to have some kind of regular business meeting structure where we say, okay, here's our budget for this coming year. Here's what we plan on spending. Even if it's only, 20 people meeting in a living room, we think our budget for candles this year is going to be $25.
Yeah.
Because among other things, it means you've created planning documents. It means that you have engaged in some forethought. You know how much money you should be asking from each member for dues. You know what an initiation ceremony costs. You're able to help people understand how the material costs of spirituality are paid for and what kind of structures are used to pay for those those tools.
Yeah, as somebody who had to learn Robert's rules and go to leadership training for my work in the nonprofit sector, um, it's a familiar and comforting current. And I share your enthusiasm for it, if for no other reason than I've seen enough groups that don't do these things and how wildly explosive they are when people don't understand all of the behind the scenes stuff that goes into planning an initiation rite or the budget for candles in a year. I've seen that in real time where either people just kind of assume we're just going to pull this out of our ass, and then they're surprised and shocked and heartbroken when the thing as they were anticipating doesn't materialize because the planning wasn't done.
Planning is an enormous part of it. I mean, I've mentioned Twilight Covening, and the group that plans Twilight Covening, which always happens Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day weekend here in the US, which is early October. They start meeting in February.
Yep.
And they begin the planning process for that major program 6 months, 7 months ahead of time. February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. So they begin it 9 months in advance. Not only do they begin it 9 months in advance, but once they are on site, practically the entire plan gets a walkthrough, gets a dress rehearsal on site, not once, but 3 or 4 times to make sure that all of the technical issues have been worked out in advance. And I was at one of the planning meetings for this most recent thing. There's like 150, 200 people at the gathering, and there were 75 people in the room. Like half of the people involved in the gathering were essentially being called in to be part of the planning committee work. And they were volunteers who were taking roles during the ritual, and they were people who were there to make sure that safety protocols were obeyed, and as well as the core volunteers that had planned the whole program. Like if you want to put on a big ritual, you can't just say, why don't you take east, why don't you take south, why don't you take west, why don't you take north, I'll be center. Aren't you center every time? Okay, well, if you want to be center, then you should learn the part.
Yep.
And one of the things that I greatly admired about Toastmasters, and this is also true in Freemasonry, where I've been a member, although not as active, is that there's an assumption that you'll walk the chairs. You're going to start in one of the junior offices. You're going to take the middle offices for a year, and then you're going to sit in the president's chair because you have learned enough of the parts that you can correct other people when they make a mistake. And that's particularly important in groups like Freemasonry, where there's a prescribed ritual.
Right.
The ritual in Toastmasters is, call to order. Let's introduce our principal officers. During today's meeting, we're going to have a bunch of functionaries that help us. Timer is sitting here. The counter is sitting here. The grammarian is there. Let's get started. Here's our first speaker. Here's our second speaker. We're going to do table topics. Let's hear from our evaluators. Let's hear from our functionaries. Thank you very much. Good night. And we're out of there in an hour. So yeah, knowing what the order of business is. Are we here for a program meeting? Are we here to discuss business? Are we here for a ritual? Do we have guests? Does our behavior change when we have guests?
Right.
All of these kinds of things play into how we should approach our spirituality. And increasingly, I don't want to be a member of groups where I don't I don't want to join any new groups where I can't read the rule book. Because
Yeah,
among
the,
other things, I want to make sure that I am not going to be subjected to abuse. And I
right.
want to make sure that I know how to behave in such a way that other people will not accuse me of abusive behaviors. I don't want to be seen as an abuser any more than anybody else wants to be seen that way. And I would like to make sure that we join groups that are not abusive and that have formal procedures for saying, we don't really like your kind here. Why don't you go find somebody else to bother?
Right. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, I mean the way that kind of pagans and magicians and occultists will kind of put a lot of stock in historical texts and grimoires and spell books, but then they won't write down how the group's going to meet and when the group's going to meet and who's says what and when and yeah, it's kind of the mundane sort of quote unquote boring stuff that no one actually wants to sit down and sort out, but that's kind of what keeps the wheels turning.
Kathleen Norris wrote a book about intentional communities, specifically Benedictine cloisters for both monks and nuns. And she was invited to speak at a conference for Benedictines. I didn't know that Benedictines had conferences, but apparently they do. Everybody has conferences and conventions. Even Benedictine monks leave the monastery to have conventions. So she's asked to speak at some convention or another, and she says more intentional communities break down over whose job it is today to take the garbage out than over any high principles or glorified ideals. And I think that that's true. Like if you don't know who's going to take out the garbage after you do this big ritual, if you don't know whose responsibility is to stay and clean up the Unitarian Universalist parish hall so that the congregation isn't mad at you on Sunday morning after your big ritual, you're sunk. Your group is not going to be welcome anywhere. And the job of figuring out whose job it is to clean up and put away the chairs and make sure that, the the burn from the candle that got knocked over is not visible in the rug is that job is important. And the person who knows how to do that and who sees to it that it gets done is more deserving of the title of high priest or hierophant than the person who claims the title. I have a great story about this. A few years ago, the guy who was the international president for Toastmasters International, like the guy who's the head of the board of directors, was in my district. He still lives in my district. Great guy. But this was just a minor event, and he had shown up for basically club officer training. Twice a year, all of the club officers of all the Toastmasters clubs are supposed to come together and meet together and go through training together. Here's how to be a club president, or here's how to be a club vice president of education. Here's how to recruit new members. Here's how to recruit members in a way that's not culty, that sort of thing.
Right.
It's at breakfast. I'm getting another piece of bacon and I hear a thump behind me, and some guy has fallen over from a heart attack on the floor in the middle of this parish hall from this rented parish church. And this guy, who, as I said, was next in line to be president of Toastmasters International, the head muckety muck, is right by the guy's side in moments. And he points at two people that I found out later had medical training. And he said, you, here, everybody else back off. He saw three more people approaching. He said, you, and you call 911. You form a line from the parking lot to that door over there so that the ambulance company knows where to come in. You clear the hall, move everybody into the auditorium, the sanctuary for the main part of the program. Let's get everybody out of here and clear the room. You go get me some water. You go get me some towels so we can put this guy's head up and elevate his head. he had us organized within an inch of our lives in this deeply concerning and emergency situation in 45 seconds. And I hadn't even picked up the piece of bacon that I had meant to grab. I don't think I did get that bacon now that I think about it. But that's what real leadership looks like. That person didn't know enough to know how to treat a medical issue, but knew who in the room was capable of doing it. They also knew enough about the members to say these three people would be great to call. This person would be great on 911. These people know how to give directions. They sussed out in 45 seconds just what skill sets were available in the room and successfully deployed them. One of my wife's pet peeves is we'll go to a restaurant and it'll be a fine dining experience, and she will be furious because she will see that the manager has not correctly deployed the wait staff on the floor. Like, it's a superpower. I don't see it myself. And she's able to say, this waitress has too many tables. That waiter doesn't have enough. And the waiter and the manager are gabbing, and there are people who are waiting for the food. It's not just us. And the one waitress is trying to do too much, and they've left her with too much to do, and they will probably steal her tips.
Yeah.
Oh. Right? And like, that's what spiritual spaces have been like for thousands of years. Is, well, rank has its privileges. I'm a high priest. I get to do whatever I want. And maybe it's time for some of the democratic ideals of the American and French Revolution to start infiltrating some of our spiritual spaces. And I think a great way to do that, at least to start, is I think it's chapter 9 in the 12th edition of Robert's Rules of Order, is how to write a constitution and bylaws. It doesn't even take very long. I banged out a first draft for my town's public library in a couple of hours.
Yeah.
Where the rubber really meets the road is when you bring the draft to the library board and say, how about this? And then they want to argue every single sentence.
Yep.
But that's what real democracy looks like, right? Thomas Jefferson and the other members of the Declaration of Independence Committee went through this in late June and early July of 1776, and all sorts of things got taken out of the Declaration of Independence draft because some of them were unacceptable to northern colonies, some of them were unacceptable to southern colonies, and some of them they feared would greatly inflame already poor relations with Great Britain, which they did quite successfully.
Yeah. One of the things that was always really striking about the BLS first aid training, basic life support, sorry, was the first thing you do is the first person on scene takes command of the scene, and then you organize everybody else. And that kind of, a lot of my experience is either in the nonprofit sector through Robert's Rules of Order with all the stuff you've already said, or it's, this is how we respond to an emergency situation. When shit hits the fan, this is how things are done. And you can see people in an instant who've had that training, because it is really that quick. It's a 45-second, okay, this is how we're doing it. This is how we're deploying. And when you have a well-oiled machine that way, you save lives, or in the case of organizational structures, you save the structure from imploding on itself.
Yes. A colleague of mine worked at a school where there was a gas explosion. And the guy who was the head of school at the time was apparently woefully unprepared to take command in an emergency situation, and wound up falling to the assistant head of school, the assistant principal of some kind. And by the end of the week, the board had fired the head of school, had fired the principal, and had promoted the assistant head to be the head of school because it was clear that this person knew how to manage in an emergency and the first guy didn't.
Do you?
So,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So leadership requires training.
Yes.
And I would say that the first thing that leaders have to learn is not what are my privileges, what are the benefits of my rank, but how do I serve the people that are under me? How do I serve and empower the people who are coming up through the ranks under me? How do I go about building a new team to replace me? At one of the first leadership trainings that I ever ran for Toastmasters, I said, here's this list of 10 things that you're supposed to do when you're a leader. Look at what the bottom one is. Look at what the 10th thing on the list is, which is find your replacement. How many of you want to be doing this job next year? Nobody raised their hands. I said, exactly. Right? What you have to do is you have to start with how do you train your replacement? How do you build the person's skills who is going to be coming in after you? And in volunteer and spiritual and in magical spaces, that question isn't asked nearly enough. And in the corporate world or in your job, you never want to train your own replacement because if your own job isn't secure, training your replacement, they'll be cheaper than you, they're younger than you, they're hungrier than you. You don't want to do that. But in a volunteer space or in a magical or in a spiritual space, you have to be looking out for who has the calling and who has the right set of attitudes and ethics to step into the role that you currently occupy, because sooner or later, you want to be able to let go of it. I think that this is one of the things that probably brought down the Golden Dawn in the early 1900s. You've got a whole bunch of people who are doing solar magic. The sun is incredibly generous. You know, the sun delivers all good things to good and bad alike. He is unstinting in his rewards. He makes the grapes grow and he gives us suntans and gives us sunburns and keeps the ocean from freezing, yada, yada, yada. The sun does everything. But that means that anyone who's doing a lot of solar work is going to have an incredibly inflated ego. It's virtually impossible for their egos not to become inflated. So you get 10 of them in a room, and who gets to be in charge? Oops.
Right. Let's all jockey for this position at the same time, shall we?
Let's all jockey for the same leadership position all at the same time, rather than recognizing, number one, that all of the people who were involved in founding the Golden Dawn came out of Freemasonry and knew that term limits were a thing. You're only supposed to serve as the worshipful master of a lodge for a year. You're only supposed to serve as an officer in the Grand Lodge for a year. And then you step down and you let somebody else do it. That is a thing that doesn't happen in most of our magical and spiritual spaces, for the very simple reason that in Christian spaces, it can take 3 to 5 years to train somebody. In Jewish spaces, it can take 10 to 12 years to train somebody to be a rabbi or to be a cantor. So it's a professional occupation. But in the occult and pagan world, we know that the priesthoods of Athens changed every year because they were elected jobs. And sometimes they elected the same person multiple years in a row, but just as often they'd elect somebody new because they wanted the job to be passed around. They wanted the job to have shared expertise. And they also wanted to limit the concentration of power. And I think that that's true in both senses of the word, right? They wanted to prevent one person or one family from holding too much power within the Athenian state. And they also did not want whoever was the high priest of Athena to become overinflated with, I am the source of all wisdom. They recognized that anybody who found themselves in that role as the high priest of all wisdom in the world was eventually going to have the same problem that lawyers who represent themselves do. They're foolish. They make bad choices. So, yeah, I think that more magical groups should be thinking about, how do we share power amongst us? How do we rotate our responsibilities so that we learn all of our different roles and responsibilities better? And how do we learn how to replicate these skills across multiple groups?
Because I know one thing that you see a lot sort of bandied about online are sort of, you mentioned rules, you said the word leadership. That's exactly why I left formal religion. It's exactly why I despise XYZ political ideas. I don't want rules and leadership in my paganism or in my magical group. That's exactly what we're trying to get away from. How dare you? And what you've said there kind of addresses that, really.
There was certainly a time when I was much more of an anarchist punk. I had that kind of mindset, like, I'm going to go it alone. I'm in my 50s. You know, it's one thing to face Armageddon when you're in your 20s and you can huff it up a mountain in a couple of hours. And it's quite another when you've got a bad knee and uh and you're thinking about retirement, and for a while there was a kid in college, and now there's a kid with maybe a grandchild on the way, and there's a very different set of priorities when it comes to thinking about Armageddon, and you realize, oh shit, I need people.
Mm.
I need a lot of people. I need people who understand how to cook the kinds of food that I like to eat. I want people that know how to build the kinds of chairs that I like to sit on. I need people who know something about medicine. I need people who know how to make and repair clothes. I need people who know something about how to make my computer work. I need people that are going to teach me how computers will work 10 years from now, right? I need people to help me understand how to manage my finances. I need people who will help me understand how to protect myself against internet phishing and whatever the latest computer scams are. I cannot learn all of this myself. And
Right.
if I belong to various kinds of social groups, some of which are spiritual and some of which are oratorical and some of which are educational, I have much better chances of running into the people that I need and finding that I have camaraderie and shared interests and the possibility for community with those people. Yeah, I like to, you know, put on all of my black clothes and, you know, I don't dance as much as I used to, but I can at least stand in the corner of a nightclub and look threatening. But mostly I just have a smile on my face and like watching everybody dance. And then I'm like, okay, it's 10 o'clock. I'm ready to go to bed.
But I
there's a picture of Henry Rollins and it says, punk is not dead. He's just going to bed at a more reasonable hour.
Yeah.
But I think this kind of allergic reaction to structure is proving to be a really big roadblock now that we're in an age where, okay, shit's happening. Do you know how to actually effectively organize? Because there's a process here that works, that has proven track records, and then there's processes that don't work and are going to cause you to waste a lot of energy.
Several of my friends are members of the Quaker community, and they're very fond of pointing out that consensus evolved in a where there has to be complete and total agreement, evolved in a community that is specifically listening to the dictates of spirit, right? So the Quakers say, we all have to be in agreement that this message, which we have just heard our brother, our sister, our sibling stand up and speak from the heart and from the head and from the gut, is in fact the leading of spirit and of the light, and that this is the message that should be obeyed, and that this is the message that we are tuned to hear, and we are in agreement that this is in fact the true light that has been revealed to us in this moment. How do you do that in an atheist materialist space like a socialist party meeting? I don't know that. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know how you can move to a position of, well, every decision has to be made by consensus when you don't have a method for listening for what consensus should actually be. On the other hand, we do know that here in the United States, that a 2/3 majority system and a 4/5 majority system exist in our Constitution and in our legal system specifically in order to slow down progressive causes. They are there in our Constitution specifically to prevent abolitionist forces from eliminating slavery too quickly in the United States. And nowadays, they are used specifically by the conservative wing of American political life to slow down idealistic and progressive causes and movements in the United States. So there's something to be said for majority rule, like 50% plus one as a standard rule. If 10 people in a room are arguing about a rule and 6 of them say, we can live with it being this way, why do you need the agreement of the other 4, especially in a voluntary organization?
Yeah, it was something that really kind of came home to me. I did the leadership training I mentioned earlier. I did that when I was in my teens, and I was a voting member on a board of directors for an educational group. We called ourselves Computer Challenge, and the digital divide was a really big talking point at that point in time. And so a lot of our work was going into schools, teaching them how to set up their own computer clubs and teaching them how to work with the machines we hooked them up with. And we were working with like millions of dollars from Apple and IBM and Dow Chemical at that point in time. And it was a really like revolutionary thing to think as a young person, as a sitting board member, I have access to literally millions of dollars worth of computer equipment, and my vote gets to dictate how this is getting used. And because of my position on the board being the youth liaison, I was tapping into all these different clubs, being their representative. Like, what do you actually want to see, guys? I'm literally speaking to like my fellow kids. Like, what do you want to see these clubs look like? I'm voting. Like, how do you want this money spent? And the weight of that was a lot sometimes, because we had to just divvy up, okay, these machines are going here, this training is going here. And we also organized a yearly robotics and animation competition. So there was a lot of work behind the scenes that didn't get seen, because I mean, these are a bunch of kids who have their own things to do and their own. This was my thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think back to those times where I was making these really weighty decisions about how these clubs were going to be operating. And, sometimes you just got to go with the people that show up and are willing to put the work in.
And often it's worth remembering that a lot of political decisions, whether you're talking about political decisions within an organization, a voluntary organization, or a spiritual or occult organization, or in a political organization, like I'm a member of 2 town government boards in my town, and Firmicus Maternus is a 3rd century astrologer. There's a translation of his work by Ben Dykes, and in one of the early chapters in book 1, he's very explicit. Like he says, you're an astrologer, you are a priest of the most high gods, and you should stay out of imperial politics. But you're also a priest of the most high gods who is in this place, and you should become involved with the social concerns of your community. Like, you have a good read on what's going on in the world. You have a care for how the world should be well managed, and you have a role in this kind of a society. So I found out that there was a position on the library board, and I ran for the library board position that was open. I found out that if I weren't elected, they wouldn't have had quorum. And so the fact that I was there made a huge difference because, state level organizations, there's a certain number of seats. And if you have fewer than that number of members, then you can't meet quorum even if you get together and have a meeting. You need somebody to be sitting in a certain minimum number of seats. So here I was a member of the board. We managed to get the board filled. And so we didn't have to worry about quorum anymore. And they said, would you like to be chair? I said, no. And they said, too bad.
Isn't that really how it goes, though? I mean, you showed up.
Yes.
Here's the job.
You showed up. And the person who has been chair is now the secretary of the library board. But she had been the chair of the board for something like 13 previous years. And she's like, I've done this long enough. I would like to make sure that somebody else has this skill set before I bow out of this work.
Right.
And okay, I have some idea of what I'm doing. I'm willing to do it. There's definitely some new wrinkles involved in a town level government board as opposed to a volunteer organization. But we still have a budget of around $20,000 a year. 3/4 of that approximately is the librarian's salary, and we don't even have a full-time librarian, but got to start somewhere.
Right.
So I've finished my first 3-year term as a member of the library board, and much to my surprise, I was nominated to the town select board. We have instead of having a mayor, we have a 3-person board that functions like a mayor, except with 3 stomachs, 6 legs, 6 arms, 3 heads, and I really didn't want the job. So I sort of made it known around town that I didn't really want the job. So they elected me to the school committee instead, which turns out to be much worse.
Oops.
19 write-in votes. Like one of the goals of magic, regardless of system, regardless of whether you're talking about Nordic work or grimoire work or Golden Dawn work, 90% of the process of becoming a magician is learning how to be competent with managing power. Well, what is the line from Beowulf? Behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere.
Shit. All right.
That's the Seamus Heaney translation, by the way. I think it's in the first 100 lines or so. Shield was still thriving when his time came and he crossed over into the Lord's keeping. His warrior band did what he bade them when he laid down the law among the Danes. They shouldered him out to the sea's flood, the chief they revered who had long ruled them. What does it take to be a chief? It means knowing the law, number one. It means faithfully executing the law, number two. Number three, it means watching out for the people, whoever the people are. Number four, it means defending them. Number five, it means empowering them. And empowering them means increasing their wealth. It means increasing their prosperity, increasing their sense of their personal security without necessarily disenfranchising them. Like a ruler who takes everything from his people in order to make them safe has not actually made them safer. That's how Beowulf ends. Spoilers. Right?
With it being recently released, people might not have had a chance to look at it yet. Yeah.
But it ends with the people grieving the loss of Beowulf and the discovery of the dragon's treasure, because they know that without Beowulf to defend them and with the rumor of the dragon's treasure being available, that every person around is going to come and rob them. Like, that leader did not do enough to secure their health and safety and prosperity. He didn't train up a new band of warriors. He wasted all of the warriors in the process of trying to defeat Grendel and Grendel's mother and the dragon.
So I want to be sort of respectful of your time and mindful of the time. So one thing I did see you promote was the Magic of Rules of Order course.
Yeah, I can provide a link to that, and I do have a recording of it. I think I'll offer that again because I think it's important enough, especially in current times. I don't know how local government boards work, but I'm sure that the local council system in Britain doesn't arrogate all of its responsibility to only 6 or 8 people. I imagine there's some kind of distributed local leadership system. And Americans, at the very least, I think, have to learn this kind of stuff for the very simple reason that if you want government of the people, by the people, and for the people, then sooner or later you have to be one of the people who shows up. There's a big city of 100,000 people, Springfield, Massachusetts, that's near me. And I went through their website and I found out that they have something like 126 positions on their various town committees and boards and commissions that are currently listed as appointed by the mayor. Like, all of those positions in theory are open to election, but if nobody shows up to run for the seats, the mayor gets to put in whoever it is. So you elect the mayor, and if the mayor is a good person, great. And if the mayor is a good person but has bad friends, not so great. If the mayor is an okay person and has a mix of good and terrible friends, you get the government you just voted for, one way or the other. On the other hand, if you are magically inclined, if you are magically inclined, carries all sorts of things with it, right? But if you are magically inclined, chances are you have a better assessment of your own skills and abilities, and you have a better assessment of where your skills and abilities in your community might be needed. And who knows, you may find yourself facing a write-in vote for the school committee before you know it.
So we had a quick but probably big, deceptively large question from a community member on our server when they heard you were coming on.
Oh
So
boy.
from Gripply, we had, what sort of insight does astrology have regarding the recent chaos that's been going on? Hurricanes, elections, global politics, general on-edge energies, and the like. Is there an estimated time frame for when things will ease up?
No.
There we go. There's your answer, Gripply. Nice.
Let me expand a little bit on that answer.
If you want to.
I think that I think astrology gives a pretty clear answer to the question of whether or not there will be an apocalypse, and the answer is no. Barring an asteroid strike, which is, not particularly predictable, because we think that we know the positions of less than 1% of all of the asteroids that cross Earth's orbit, much less random space debris. You should plan on life continuing as it has continued for these many generations. But some level of chaos is always going to be normal. The chaos is going to look different at different times. But I think that we can look to the most recent conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Every Jupiter and Saturn conjunction, there's about 20 years between them. Roughly every 240 to 260 years, sometimes as little as 160 years, they change not simply signs, but they change elements. So since 1803, Jupiter and Saturn have been conjuncting in Earth signs. And when you think back over the last 200-ish years, back to 1803, it's matter and energy. It's the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. It is learning how to manipulate physical matter. It is learning how to release the energy that is stored in physical matter, whether we're through turning it into dynamite or turning it into atom bombs. So we have spent most of the last 200 years learning how to work with matter and energy. And we have gotten about as far down that particular track as we're going to get at this time, right? We have figured out how to smash mountains flat, mine them out of all of their various materials, turn it into electricity, and then run that electricity through rock so that rock thinks.
Right.
For some definition of thinks, I'm doing air quotes around the word thinks. But in 2020, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn took place in the sign of Aquarius, and they will occur in air signs from now until the late 2200s. I think it's till 2291. None of us alive currently are likely to be alive when the air age that currently is just started ends. So what happens when we look back at previous air ages? When we look back at previous air ages, the last one was in the 1100s, 1200s, and early 1400s. That's the era of the Golden Horde and Genghis and Kublai Khan. It is the age of the Mongol domination of Central Asia from what is now Poland to the northern parts of China. What else happened during that time period? Well, it was also the age of the sort of the early part of that era was the golden age of Islam. It was also a time of tremendous networking. You had the Cistercians in Europe, you had the Sufis in the Islamic world, setting up all sorts of local nodes of information, libraries, craftsmen, artisans of various kinds. We're building cathedrals, we're building universities, we are building networks of scholars each within their own sphere of influence. There's an emergence of madrasas and Islamic universities all across the Islamic world. Political divisions, massive political divisions, and massive decentralization of empires, right? Emperors and kings wind up having very little power during this time period. Nobles take over local administration to a very high degree. Fast moving armies. Think drones and cavalry instead of infantry holding territory. Think archers dominating battlefields instead of spearmen. Think about the fact that the last air age was the age not simply of the Mongols, but also of the Black Death. It was the era of plague. It was the era when medicine was facing all sorts of new challenges and having to invent all sorts of new techniques and technologies in order to cope with new forms of illness. It was also tremendously important from a commercial point of view, right? The Silk Road opens during this time period, and trade between China and Europe flourishes along both land and sea routes. The Spice Islands become a source of tremendous wealth for Arabic and Indian merchants trading with the Genoese and with the Venetians. The Mediterranean is essentially a gigantic superhighway for goods, materials, and information, and so are the sea routes through the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and all the way around to China. So the world of the next 200 years has a very high likelihood of having highly decentralized political systems where local autonomy matters considerably more than what federal or confederal systems would like. Two, we're going to see the emergence of lightly armed, low-powered military forces being able to dominate and overwhelm much larger and much more expensive land forces of various kinds. And we've even seen this. The Houthis were able to close the Red Sea with drone warfare. The US was able to reopen the passageway by deploying aircraft carriers, but it means that those aircraft carriers are now locked into specific positions to defend specific parts of the sea routes.
Yeah. The war in Ukraine right now is being fought with a combination of hard targets and drone warfare.
And soft targets are also increasingly important, right?
Yep.
Because if you can change populace's minds, think air equals mind.
Right.
If you can change people's minds by the internet as much as by military hardware being dropped from above, you can change the shape of the battlefield. The internet is a battlefield, and this stuff is going on constantly, and it's going to be going on constantly. Now, let's go back to air ages. Let's go back to the one that came before the one in the 1100s. When is that one? That one's in the 300s AD to the early 600s AD. That's the era in which the Roman Empire in the West falls to barbarian invasions. You've got the Huns, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths. You know, it's too early for the Vikings.
Yeah.
But we are seeing wave after wave of climate change refugees. The climate change refugee problem in the 300s and 400s is not that the equator regions are getting too warm. It is that the polar regions are getting too cold. And the horse tribes that are surviving on the steppes of Russia flee out of Russia because the grass is dying and freezing and turning into tundra. Those people are looking for places that are warmer. They're looking for places that are wetter. They are looking for places where there's more arable land for grazing. And the knights in shining armor of the 12 and the 1300s are the trouser-wearing horse lords of the 400s and 500s. Right? So, and it's the same kind of model of decentralized state. We don't have an army. We have 40,000 tribespeople on the move who are tired of being threatened by the official armies of the major hegemonic power of the era. So the chaos is not going to stop. It's just going to take slightly different forms. And it may be helpful to remember that air is not its own turbulence, right? The storm that happens in the air is part of the framework of an air age. But the storm is not the air itself. The thing that is going to make you a successful person in an air age is based, I think, on two pieces. The first is, what do you know? What do you know how to do that you can do without internet, without library, without lots of YouTube sources, without GitHub, without AI? Because what you know how to do, what you carry around in your own head, is going to matter considerably more. And the second thing that's going to matter is who you know. What communities and what networks are you hooked into? What organizations do you participate in? What mutual aid systems do you participate in? Which of your neighbors do you know, and which of your neighbors like you? If you're a reasonably skilled artist or artisan, if you know how not just to make art for your own pleasure, but you know how to make art or craft things that other people want and need, if you know how to solve other people's problems, you are much more useful. There's a chapter that Eric Arneson and I have discussed in his podcast called Wizards of the Future. The episode is called Wizards of the Future. It's the Arnemancy podcast. But there's a chapter in Picatrix. I think it's book 3, chapter 4, but I might have that backwards, and maybe it's book 4, chapter 3, something like that, which lists all of the things that someone who intends to be a wizard needs to know how to do. And there's agriculture, and there's politics, and there's mechanics, and there's designing water irrigation systems, and there's knowing how to build siege engines, and there's knowing metallurgy. Like, you got stuff you got to learn. Go learn it. And that's the thing that's going to make you successful in an air age and give you the power to cope with the chaos, is knowing how to do things and knowing who to do them for.
And I think on that note, I want to thank you for coming onto the show. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and insights. I think we could probably keep going and double the length of the episode if we stay
quite
here
easily.
all night.
Yeah.
Well, next time I come back, we'll talk about sewing and woodworking and magic and how they all fit together.
I love
How
it.
about that?
Yes.
Awesome. So in between people learning how to construct their own trebuchets and build their own aqueducts, if people wanted to look more into your work, where could they go?
You can find me at andrewbwatt.com. I'm also Andrew B. Watt on Twitter, although I don't know how much longer I'm going to be posting there. I think I'm also Andrew B. Watt on this new service called Blue Sky, and I'm also on Mastodon. And mostly what I do in all those places is post links back to andrewbwatt.com. So that's the best place to find me.
Excellent. Snow.
Well, when I am between learning how to build my own trebuchet, you can find me at snowthegoth.com or linktree/snowthegoth, and all my things are there.
Are you a Visigoth or an Ostrogoth?
Yes. A Robert Smith goth.
You can find our friend and co-host at streakingfate.wordpress.com. If you want to keep up with my work, you can find my work at sarth.wordpress.com. You can also, if you wish to commission me for a prayer or a topic, or if you wish to commission me for rune work and divination, you can find me at patreon.com/Saranth Odinson. And you can also find our show's Patreon at patreon.com/AroundGrandfatherFire. You do not need to be a member of the Patreon to join the Discord, but we definitely encourage you to join both because we appreciate all of your support here and elsewhere. And please, 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 if you can, give us a 5-star review on all your favorite app products that you use to listen to the show. And anything else, Snow, that we need to tackle or cover?
Start drafting your trebuchets now.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to start drafting, and I want to thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time around the fire.